Hello, students. Let's discuss today the one more theory that we have, which is a supply side theory, which is kind of a blend of the different theories we've seen before in a simple way. First, I'd like to remind you that this interactive game exists where you can try to balance, you can try to be the Federal Reserve using monetarism, and you can try to balance the growth of the economy, the growth of GDP, which means less unemployment, and the keep the growth of inflation down. At the same time, it's a tough balancing act. If you play the game, you'll understand a little bit better what the Federal Reserve does. And there's two different ones. There's one for both fiscal and monetary policy, and one for just fiscal policy. Now let's talk about supply side economics. Okay, this has been um, a very controversial topic, and so we're going to look at the evidence and see what happens. In essence, Keynes said that in a recession, in a slowdown, the government should try to stimulate the economy. And so what has that has been interpreted as, for the most part, is the government should spend more money. And since they don't want to raise taxes in recession, because that's going to hurt the economy, and you're trying to lift the economy up, not hurt it, it usually means borrowing the money from other countries, which puts the nation in the hole. So in terms of debt. So another way to implement Keynesian theory to stimulate the economy is instead of stimulating demand and stimulating consumption, because demand always has one good effect and one bad effect, as we've covered in the past, that you should try to stimulate supply in the short run. So this takes the idea of Keynesian theory, but in terms of the government, more government spending in a way, but without actually spending money, but providing more money to business through tax cuts. So when the government cuts taxes, that's a form of spending, actually, because they're losing money. And so instead of spending money, like giving money directly out to stimulate demand, supply side theory says, well, we should use Keynesian theory to instead provide money to business. And instead of sending them a check, you just cut their taxes by cutting taxes. And that way the government is actually promoting investment instead of consumption. So instead of stimulating demand, we can stimulate supply. So that's kind of a new variation of Keynesian theory. And then it also blends in Say's law, because Say's law was saying that the best thing for the economy in the long run is to increase supply. Except in supply side economics, instead of the government staying out of it and the government not doing anything and letting supply recover by itself, in supply side economics, they said to try to take the best of both worlds. Let's take the best of Say's law and have supply increase, but instead of doing it in the 1800s way, just let the economy fix itself. We'll borrow the idea from Keynes that the government should get involved and have the government stimulate supply. So it's kind of a blend of both of those theories, and to try to take the best of both worlds. And it's usually been pretty effective, even though it's very unpopular with people who like to spend the government's money and like to stimulate demand, because then you're giving money directly to the voters, and they will tend to vote for you. So how does this work? Well, if the government cuts taxes, that's a form of fiscal stimulus or budgetary stimulus, because you're taking the money out of the budget by not taxing business, or in some case, business and individuals. This will increase supply, increase investment, and therefore supply instead of demand. So when businesses invest more, this is going to increase wages because they're going to need more demand for workers. They're going to need to pay workers more because they're going to need more workers. So it leads to more wages and more profits because more investment, of course, the more you invest, the more you can produce and sell, so the more money you make. So there'll be more wages and profits, which will mean, again, more spending. So it will lead to more GDP. Demand will follow supply, according to Say's law. But instead of waiting 2 years or a year and a half for it to happen, the government will make it happen right away. And then this will make GDP go up. And when GDP goes up, well, then your taxes will go back up. So you cut the taxes, but when you multiply, you cut the tax rate. But when you multiply, you get a higher GDP number. When you multiply the higher GDP number by the lower tax rate, you're going to get more tax dollars because you're multiplying by a larger GDP. You have more wages, you have more income, you have more profits. And so even though you lower the rate in the beginning to get the ball rolling, the idea is that eventually you create more GDP, more income, and then even though the rate is lower, it's multiplied by a bigger number because you have more income to multiply it by. So since business profits and wages are both taxed and you're increasing wages and profits, then the tax cut should in theory be recovered over time as more income means more taxes. So here's a blue and red, Democrat, Republican, just to show you that, both parties have tried this. So despite the fact that both parties in the US constantly argue about many, many things, we have to recognize that both parties have tried this in the past. Usually the better presidents try this. President Kennedy had an ITC, investment tax credit, which gave businesses 10% credit on their taxes if they invested more in the economy. And so it wasn't very generous. But in the 60s, the economy was not as large as it is today. And so they really couldn't afford to give out a lot of money. So that was in 1964. I mean, it took effect after he passed away because he was assassinated, unfortunately. President Reagan cut tax rates by 50% twice in 1981, 1986, for everybody, basically. Then President Clinton had a small middle-class tax cut. Again, the Democrats don't tend to give big tax cuts because they like to have a lot of government spending, more so. So they give smaller tax cuts. But it's still the same idea. Now, President Bush Jr., Baby Bush, he's passed tax cuts in 2001 and then again in 2003. So the economy did well for the first 4 years. And then he made some large mistakes in the next 4 years and crashed the economy in the financial crisis. So, but not the brightest of presidents, but he did implement this theory a couple of times. President Obama proposed cutting the corporate tax rate to 24%, but Congress didn't want to cooperate with him for political reasons, so that they could argue. And then President Trump copied the idea and at almost the same rate, a little bit slightly reduced to 21% because he wanted to be different. And then, of course, they both trash talked each other, but they both had the same idea, which was a good idea because the economy did well after that. So looking at how this works, the idea is to have the government stimulate the economy, increase the long-run aggregate supply within the next year, by cutting taxes. Tax cuts usually take a year to go into effect, just like any budget changes. So he did this twice in 2016. It was passed, took effect in 2017. And more recently, the 2017 tax cuts had a 10-year life. They were going to expire. And so they were in 2026, they were extended to be permanent. And then other tax cuts for working people were put in there, specifically uh, no tax for most senior citizens on Social Security, no tax on overtime, no tax on tips, and no tax on interest that you pay when you buy a car, which is very small anyway. But basically the same 2016 tax code was extended. If it expired, then tax rates would have doubled in many cases. So let's look at the effect of this. There's some debate on it. So let's look at what happens to tax revenues. So again, the idea is you cut the rate of tax, which increases investment, more wages and profits, which is more GDP. Since you have a higher GDP number, then you apply the lower rate to the higher GDP number and you get the taxes back. So here's when the tax cuts went in by 82, and we were in a deep recession here. And so what's happened is we have about a level of $600 billion in tax revenues. And we see that by the time Reagan left, if the 600 had doubled, it would be a trillion two. So tax revenues had almost doubled by that time due to the growing economy. So over 8 years of his term, this is not even 8 years. If I went out 8 years, it would be to 91 or 1990 at least. And then you see the tax rates just about doubled. Definitely 8 years after 82 would be 1990. So it looks like it would have been just about doubling by that time. So some people say, well, you're cutting the tax rate, you're going to have less tax revenue, you get a big deficit, you're going to create a deficit and so forth. But actually, we had more tax revenues. Now, we did have a deficit because government always spends more than it takes in. They took all this money and they spent more. So, but that's not due to the taxes not coming in. Now we see here what happened with Bush Jr. in 2001. So again, it takes about a year for these things to take effect. And then the tax revenues went from around 1900 to around $1.9 trillion to $2.7 trillion by the end of his term. And then he screwed up the economy and it started to go down again. So this is 800, a difference of 800 billion. So almost half, 50% in 4 years. So 50% in 4 years, if it had continued, if he hadn't messed up the economy in 2008 by helping to cause the financial crisis, it went up 50% in 4 years. So that's on track to go up 100% to double in 8 years. So similar to the effect under Reagan. So let's see the effect. This is the tax cuts that Obama proposed. Obama wasn't able to get it in. So you see that the tax receipts were slowly climbing out of the 2009 recession, very slowly, from baby Bush Jr. And then what happened is that we see that the tax cut was put in. It had a very slow effect here, and eventually the economy started booming in 2020. And this is the rate of change. The change was 100 billion in the beginning, and then by 3 years later, it jumped up to another $700 billion. So a very large change. And then we had COVID, and we started to lose a lot of tax money during COVID and the inflation. So it took a while to get going for the investment to pour into the economy, but eventually it had a big $700 billion leap with the tax cuts that Obama proposed and that Trump put in. And then here's Kennedy with his ITC. And we see that tax receipts went from 80 to twice that would be 160, so 140. So again, almost double in this case in about 64 to 69. So in about 5 years, already almost doubled. So it didn't even take 8 years. So Kennedy's was very successful. So the point is that you see a lot of stuff in the media, and a lot of people argue, well, if you cut the tax rate, then you get a lot less money coming in, but it's not true. Basically, that you see that tax revenues went up dramatically in all these cases. So it does pay for itself. Does it mean that we got rid of deficits during this time? No, because the other part of deficits is not only what you take in, it's what you spend. And the government gets a dollar and they spend two. So the deficits always have been high during these periods, except for the Clinton era, because the Congress spends more than they take in. Even if they take in more, they're going to spend more. What about the impact on growth? Here's the 80s, Reagan. Here's the 2000s, Baby Bush. Here's 2017 under Trump. And here's the 1960s under Kennedy. So, the economy grew the best during Reagan, and I want to say Baby Bush here. And then because the economy is a lot larger, there was so much less in 2017. But the economy is larger, so it's hard, like a giant truck, it's harder to move. And in the 60s, under Kennedy, we also had a great economy, was small. So even a little push was enough to make it grow a lot. So it does lead to economic growth. It does work. And so here's the trend of the GDP that we just covered. And that's it for that topic. So that's supply side economics. Each of these theories works in a different way. So you should study how they work. And that's the difference between them. And that's all for today.